Hi there. We have a question for you. How do you stay informed about the latest news? If you said through the help of journalists, you are correct. For some of us who watch the news, it may be overwhelming. But what is it like for a journalist? Through the presence of articles, news, and even interviews, we are educated on the current situation of the world. Recently, we spoke to Leslie Rangel, a morning news anchor, a Latina journalist, and a yoga educator. Rangel is the founder of the News Yogi, a platform that emphasizes the importance of yoga for all journalists. Thanks to journalists, news reporters, and morning news anchors for all the work that you're doing. We hope you enjoy this episode of Inside the Minds of Great Yogis. Vanakkam, Namaste, and hello everyone. This is Swathi Sharnavi, and welcome to the 25th episode of Inside the Minds of Great Yogis. Co-hosting with me is my sister Sharnavi Sharnavi.
Hi everyone, my name is Sharnavi Sharnavi, and I'm super excited to be co-hosting today.
So we're so excited to be back, and today we are joined by a very special guest, Leslie Rangel,
who is an award-winning journalist and news reporter. Let's give a big round of applause to
Hi Leslie, welcome to the show.
Hello, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to chat.
We're excited to have you. Thank you so much for joining us. So this interview will be divided into 4 parts. We will be covering yoga and journalism, as well as Leslie's platform, The News Yogi, and finally some questions regarding representation. So without further ado, let's get started.
So first, we're going to start off with yoga questions. So Leslie, how did you start your yoga journey?
Yeah, so I started my yoga journey in college. I went with a friend to a yoga class. I was having a rough time in school that week, just with exams and just not keeping a healthy schedule. I was pulling all-nighters and things like that. So her suggestion to me, she was in nursing school. Her suggestion to me was, you should take a yoga class with me, and I did. I did not know it was hot yoga, so I had no idea what to expect. And I went, and because it was so hot in there and I had hardly eaten and I had little to no sleep, I ended up passing out. So, but jokingly, now when I teach students, my yoga students, I always say that was the day that I literally fell in love with yoga. And there was just something about the practice that was different. I have always, in the years before, I was very active. I was in dance team when I was in high school, and then I was very into fitness and boot camp and track and things like that. And so I loved working out. But when I did yoga, I realized that it was different. It's a physical practice, that portion of it, but it was different than like when I was doing burpees and pull-ups and things like that. And so that was kind of the start of me and my yoga journey. And since then, I kept going. I didn't stop. I was like, something's different about this. So
yeah, I love that. So what role does yoga play in your mental health?
Oh, it's so important in my mental health. And that kind of goes along with how I just described what, really my journey has been. I think because I realized that it was more than just the physical practice, right? It was this something that was happening up here in my mind, in my brain. And when I would leave class, I would just feel so light. And so like everything was just like problem.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I started to be curious on things about me. I think just the nature of my life and how I've grown up, and then the career that I went into, you don't really focus on yourself at all. It's always about other people. And so yoga really allowed me to kind of turn that lens on myself. So, yeah.
Beautifully said. Sorry to cut you off, but I really like what you mentioned there. I think
yoga is all about that self-realization and finding your true and authentic self. So I really did resonate with that. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I'll give it over to my sister to
Yeah.
continue the question.
That's awesome. So my last final question is, as a yoga educator, who is your main focus?
My main focus, you mean my students?
Yes.
Yeah, student-wise, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say that my main focus is really journalists who look like me or who've been in my shoes and really struggle with the mental health portion. Kind of again tying it back a little bit to what I just said. It as a journalist, it's really when as a journalist we tell other people's stories, right? And we focus on other stories and other issues that are going on. And a lot of times we can get sort of buried into that news hole, so to speak. And we forget about ourselves. And for example, I'm a daughter of immigrants and I'm the oldest. And so whether or not expectations were vocalized to me, there's kind of, for me and my experience, there was kind of like an understanding of, you're the oldest, you have to set the example. And so it was difficult for me again to put myself first, because in my mind it was always like I've got to be the example, I've got to be perfect, I've got to make sure that I'm doing good because my sisters are watching. I have two younger sisters, and so again, that aspect of not putting myself first. And so when I went into this career in journalism, it's more of not putting yourself first, right? Because the stories aren't about yourself, it's about other people in the community and what stories in the community need to be told. And so with that can come forgetting you're a human and that you have stuff going on. And so I think it's so important for me to share yoga, not only the asana aspect but the other limbs of yoga, to journalists, because right now a lot of journalists are feeling burnt out and a lot of journalists they're leaving. The data shows, there's a lot of data that shows that journalists are leaving the profession. And my hope is that other journalists will also too turn the lens on themselves through the tools that yoga can afford. Because it's important. It's important for people who look like you and me to be able to share these stories, because we need storytellers who are able to tell all stories across all communities, all different languages, all different perspectives, all different cultures. And so when we begin to have only one group of people telling other stories, sometimes it could either be incomplete or maybe the stories might be misunderstood. And so ultimately, my hope is that journalists will start turning the lens on themselves to just come to places where they're more mentally fit, more mentally healthy, and remind themselves it's okay to take a break to help with some of that burnout and some of that struggle and some of that stress. Because I always say, ultimately, if we can't recognize that we're humans, how are we able to go out and tell human stories?
Absolutely. Yeah. Representation is super important in journalism. When we see journalists that look like us, or when even with my friends, when they see journalists that look like them, news reporters covering news, like we feel represented, right? We feel empowered. So I think that's so important. And also, when you said that you were the oldest out of with your siblings, I can agree with that, because I'm also the oldest. She's my younger sister. So there's a lot of responsibility when you're the older one. You have to be the example, lead by example, so that the younger siblings actually follow us as well. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. So now we are going to be doing the journalism side of things. So in the year 2020, a lot of the news had a negative impact on society consuming this information, which eventually affected their mental health. However, how do you, as journalists, how do you process this information?
Yeah, I think when you've been in the business long enough, I think there's a portion of you that becomes numb to it. And
Mhm.
sometimes that can be a good thing, but sometimes that can be a difficult thing to come to terms with, because when we do become numb to some of these stories that are really difficult and really impactful, I think we begin to lose that humanity aspect of it. And I think, you mentioned during 2020 there was a lot of news consumption, and the data is out there for sure to show that a lot of folks were really just overwhelmed with the headlines that were happening, and no wonder, right? We were going
Mhm.
through a pandemic, and there were and a racial reckoning in our country, and so I think it was all really, really heavy. Yes, that news is important, but I think it's important to also consume it in a healthy dose. As I've gone through my yoga journey and dived a little bit deeper into meditation aspects, one of the things, and research shows as well, one of the things that really helps keep a balanced view of our world, I think, is remembering gratitude. And that can be so hard to hold on to. And sometimes it can, the word's not coming to me, but it can feel like, oh, well, it's easy for you to be grateful for things when I've got something that's really awful. And so I
Mhm.
don't mean to make light of it. It's more just, I think that there are things that we can all find gratitude in,
Right.
and
Yeah.
Yes.
even just, the ability to breathe. The teachings of the Dalai Lama come to mind. I watched a documentary of, it was the Dalai Lama and the Archbishop Desmond Tutu, and the way they described gratitude and joyfulness in the midst of their lives, and how incredibly traumatic both of their lives were, but
Mhm.
still they found small things to smile about and be grateful for. And that was a documentary that I actually just watched recently, and I really feel that it changed my life. And it sounds so cliche, but it's so true. There's so much bad and awful and destruction and traumatic things happening in the world, but within that, you can find something to smile about. The fact that here we are in 2022 and we're talking to each other, and we met each other through social media.
Mhm.
The fact that I'm sitting inside and it's cool and I have AC when it's really hot outside, and just little things that you can find joy in. And I think that's what's important.
Yeah,
Yes.
beautifully said. And
Mhm.
showing gratitude is something that's really important because some of us, take things for granted and we don't appreciate the smallest things we have. So, like you said, showing gratitude to even the smallest things we have can really make life so complete. And that is a huge thing with yoga as well. So, thank you for sharing that. And the next question I would like to come into is, what are some important skills to cultivate in order to be a successful journalist?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the first thing is curiosity, right?
Yeah.
Being curious about everything. I remember sometimes at the beginning of my journalism career, I would get so stuck in a rut of like, oh my gosh, what's my next story going to be? What's my next story going to be? And I guess a little bit of imposter syndrome with it, like, oh, that story's not going to be good enough. But I had a mentor once tell me, if you're curious about it, that means somebody else is curious about it. And then it's so
Mhm.
important. It goes back to kind of those perspectives, right? The
Yeah.
sharing those diverse perspectives and having diverse journalists. Because if I'm curious about something and I'm like, hey, wait a minute, something's off here, or this is a really cool story, it needs to be told. It's important. So
Yeah, for sure.
Mhm.
Yeah, so like what you said there about curiosity is something that's really important. And when you said the word curiosity, it reminds me of my sister because she would ask a lot of questions as well, like to her teachers and everything. So I just watch her in admiration, like how is she asking some of these questions? In order to ask some questions, right, we need to have that knowledge and about like the question that we're asking about. So curiosity is a big one. So thank you for sharing that. And the next question I would like to come into is, what are some of the pros and cons of being a journalist?
Yeah, I like that question, and I'll build up a little bit on the previous question too, what other tools are important. I think it's important to really surround yourself in different perspectives, going into different communities and seeing how other people, live their day-to-day life. Try a new restaurant in a part of town that you might not typically go all the time, or a different type of food, or try a different arts and culture festival. So those are all things, really get to know the world around you. And with that is a little bit of the pros is, you get to, I was teaching a meditation to my students about really feeling grounded, especially in such a career where you tend to travel a lot, right? And some of my journalist students were like, well, I don't really travel across the country like, say, national correspondents do. And I was like, no, but we're always traveling, even if it's locally, you're popping up here and there. Your mind is always traveling with this notification and that notification. So it's always a constant, like, taking it from place to place. And so it's a beautiful thing, right? The traveling aspect of it and the curiosity aspect of it. But the other side of that coin, so I guess the con can be that we can always be here and there and here and there, and you forget to ground a lot of times and come home. And for me, that's where the yoga is, the reminding myself to come back to me and to remember that, the present moment is here, and it's important to live in it, because there's a beautiful quote by Sahara Rose. I'm not sure if you're familiar with her work, but I'm paraphrasing here, but she says, sometimes we're so busy living in hyperventilation of what's happening in life and in the world that we forget that life is happening in the space between the breath. And it just resonated so much with me, because I'm like, it's so true. We're always like the next thing and the next thing and the next thing, but it's like life is here in that space. So that's
Absolutely. Yeah. So it's important to be in the present moment, like being mindful of everything we have. And rather than being in the past or the future, what's going to happen in the future, it's important to live now so that we all feel complete, right? Because life is short. So it's important to live in the present and kind of enjoy it fully. So the next question I would like to come into is, when watching the news, we have noticed news reporters using different voice variations. So how important is voice variation in journalism? Sometimes it's high pitch, sometimes it's low pitch, sometimes it's medium. So
yeah, I think especially I can speak for work in TV, because that's primarily where my stories air. It's just like storytelling, I can talk to you right now, and we could be talking right now about journalism, and you'll notice it in my voice. But then I could talk to you right now and really talk to you about journalism, and you'd likely notice it in my voice. And then I could talk to you about journalism, and you'd really notice it in my voice. And so, it's like, wow, I said the same thing 3 times, but you're able to really notice the delivery of the story, and it helps. One of the things that we were actually taught in journalism school, specifically for TV, is like, if someone is in the kitchen cooking and they're listening to a story, they're not always watching, right? But if they're listening and they can tell by the way the reporter is delivering the story, they'll be able to notice, oh, this is something important, I need to turn around. And it's important, for example, at the time of this recording, the president just tested positive for COVID. And so if you heard someone say, the president just tested positive for COVID, it'd be like, that's really strange. Like, what a strange delivery. And so the people delivering it likely had a little bit more urgency, a little more seriousness to that. So yeah, I think it helps really just in the delivery of the story.
Yeah, well said. Both of us really enjoyed the voice variation when you were like sharing like the one common thing, but you said it in three different voice variations. We really enjoyed what you shared there. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
And the next question I would like to come into is how important is perspective in journalism? Because one person can say yes to something, whereas another one can say no. So how important is perspective?
Yeah, I think perspective is important, and I think it's the basis of, again, good journalism. Really being able to share different viewpoints and allowing the people who are reading your pieces to come to their conclusions based on the facts. So, perspective, I would say, is definitely important.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for sharing that. So now I'm going to be giving it over to my sister to cover both yoga and journalism.
Okay, so Leslie, so you are a journalist and a yoga educator. So how did you form your platform, the News Yogi?
Yeah, so the News Yogi started as it was something that my photographer called me jokingly because I was always doing yoga in the middle of waiting for my next live shot or when we were going to interviews, whether it was a yoga pose or a breath work or, looking through flashcards or whatever for my teacher trainings. And he said, you're the news yogi. And I said, I love that. I'm going to take that. And so it wasn't until maybe 4 or 5 years later from that the news yogi actually became a platform. And it started actually at the height of the pandemic. A friend of mine, she's a national correspondent for CBS, Deborah Alfarone, she teaches young journalists on how to develop their on-camera presence. And she said, I've got my students that I'm teaching. We all are really confused on whatever the heck this coronavirus thing is. Can you help us? Because we're all stressed and the world is shut down and we don't know what to do. And you seem to have it together. And I was like, well, I don't know that I have it together, but I have tools to help me just live right here now. And so I led a meditation. I was really nervous because I wasn't sure that journalists were ready to hear about meditations and mantras and chakras and affirmations and the whole thing. And so I was really nervous and I got done with the meditation. It was probably like 10 or 15 people on a Zoom call. And afterwards, I got done and there was kind of silence. And so my imposter syndrome just kicked in. It was like, Leslie, you shouldn't have done that. People are, now everybody's going to blast you on Twitter and say this crazy person is talking about chakras. And then like split second later, someone says, that was the most amazing thing. Where do we do this more? Do you teach classes? And I was just overwhelmed because it was an emotional like 180. And so from then it was kind of like journalists needed me and I couldn't say no. And so from there I started a website. I started a social media page dedicated to sharing mental wellness tools for journalists and yoga tools. And I kind of haven't stopped. There's been little intermittent pauses just because life has happened, but I'm still here and I'm still teaching. So
Yeah, I love that.
That's wonderful. I think like the work you're doing through News Yogi is incredible. It's reaching a lot of journalists, and we hope that it reaches more people, so more journalists specifically. So thank you for the work that you're doing.
thank you.
So, yeah, my next question is, why do you think yoga should be accessible to journalists?
Yeah, I think it just builds on what we've been talking about, right? Journalists right now we're stressed. Journalists are stressed. I would even take it further to say that a lot of journalists are very unregulated and are living with trauma, whether it's trauma that journalists have experienced or it's vicarious trauma, experiencing the trauma through what's going on in the world around us. And it seems really that since 2020, our news cycle has been very breaking news, and there has been a lot of traumatic news that has happened. And so it's crucial. I would almost say journalists' lives depend on having yoga tools accessible to them. And when I say yoga tools, I don't mean everybody needs to do down dog and tree pose and it'll save your life, right? I mean that the act of being mindful, the act of being able to withdraw and come within and do those inner work practices of what yoga really is. So you likely know, yoga means union, and yoga is the journey of the self through the self. It's not about the poses. In fact, you could never roll out your mat and be a yoga practitioner for life. And I think that's the part that gets misunderstood, right? Because Western society has warped, I think, what yoga truly is. And so it's important to remember the roots, the real roots of yoga, and what yoga's intention was originally meant to be. And the poses didn't come till years later, right?
Yeah.
So I think yoga is so important and crucial, not only for journalists, but for every human. And yoga can be taking a walk and admiring the beauty of the trees. Yoga can be laughing. Yoga can be meeting with loved ones. Yoga can be just breathing and really taking that moment to think about the beauty of the breath and how it's moving into our lungs and we're able to be alive, right? It doesn't have to be the down dog and the cool poses. That's fun too. but yeah, so I think it's so crucial.
Yeah. Well said. I think in terms of like when you said the downward dog, I've seen like on social media people put out things where they talk about like inverted poses and stuff. So I think giving importance to yourself and being in the present moment is very important.
Yeah.
So my last and final question is, how important is it to normalize mental health and well-being conversations in the news industry?
Yeah, it's so important and it's so crucial, especially in an industry where we I think understand that we're first responders in a way, and not to take away from any other first responders, but we all have an important tool, right? Police officers typically respond when something wrong is happening, and you've got firefighters who respond to help save lives from burning buildings, and then you've got EMS that responds when people are in need of medical attention, and so journalists respond when that need for information needs to be given to communities. And so I think in the way that a lot of first responders go to places and are the first ones there to really witness some of these traumatic things, I think journalists too are the same in witnessing some of these things that are happening firsthand, and it's tough, right? It's tough to be out there and to tell these stories, and so it's so important to normalize that mental health and wellness conversation, because if we don't take the time and space to, again, recognize ourselves as humans, we continue living in this life of dysregulation. And so dysregulation, it just continues leading into a continuance of problems, right? And so burnout, leaving the industry, many problems. And so it's so important to know that it's okay to not be okay, to know that, a morning anchor in Austin also deals with stress and trauma, and also, sometimes has to turn off the news, even if I work in news. And it's important to know that, people who have really big bylines and who are writing really big stories, they're humans too. And I think when we can all, again, see each other as humans, including ourselves, that's what helps make for a more well understood perspective of our communities, and in turn really just helps us tell better stories in the community.
Yeah, that's well said.
Well said. So and now we want to come into the last set of questions we have for you about representation. So the first one is that when we came across your bio, we noticed that you're a Latina journalist. So what is the significance of emphasizing on the value of identity?
Yeah, I think the significance is really to show other people that, our world is diverse in the way not only people look, but in their upbringing, in their cultures, in their languages. And I think that's what the beauty of this country is, right? That we all have different lived experiences. And it's important, again, for journalists and newsrooms to have diverse experiences, because my experience is different than my coworkers. It's different than my other news friends in journalism. And they may see a story that I may not see because they have those lived experiences. And in turn, I may see a story that's important because I have those lived experiences. And so if we have only a certain group of people with only one belief and only one identity, it could definitely skew the way stories are told. And so it's important to be able to have those diverse perspectives, those diverse identities, those diverse gender orientations, just the diversity of who people really are, in order to be able to completely share all stories that are important.
Beautifully said. Inclusion and diversity within yoga. And as you said, the news industry is super important. So thank you for sharing that. And the final question we have for you is, for the Latina youth who may be watching this, what is your message to them?
For the Latina youth, I would say you are enough. You are enough. You are enough. You are enough. You are beautiful. You don't need to change anything about yourself. Um, you're perfect the way you are. I think so many times it can be easy to want to conform to a different type of beauty standard, whether that's physically, emotionally. I myself, I'm loud, I do fit that stereotype of the loud Latina. I love dancing. My hair is black. I used to dye it blonde. I would I used to not understand the value of who I was as a person, and I was always striving to change that, always striving to make myself smaller in many ways, including, facing things like eating disorders for literally wanting to make myself smaller. And so I think it's just so important that you stay true to who you are, and believe in the beauty of yourself, because we need it. We need people who are true to themselves and who appreciate themselves and know they are worthy, just the way they are.
Beautifully said. I think it's so important to love yourself first,
Yeah.
and like have the trust in you. And I think it's so important for everyone watching this, especially young people out there. Just know that you're beautiful just the way you are. You're worthy. You don't need any type of filters from social media. You're just beautiful the way you are. So it's important to embrace ourselves, right? So thank you for sharing that message with us, Leslie. And Sharnavi?
Yes, and that is the end of our questions. Leslie, thank you so much for joining us on our 25th episode of Inside the Minds of Great Yogis. We appreciate you for giving us your valuable time and hope we can do this again. And thank you to everyone who has yet to listen to our 25th episode of Inside the Minds of Great Yogis. Until next time, have a great day, everyone.
Have a wonderful day, everyone. And thank you so much for joining us, Leslie.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.